Hello YouTube, this is a video that will be comparing the Roman Empire with the Byzantine Empire. The Roman Empire was predominantly a pagan empire. It was based on a system of urbanization. Agriculture was still the basis of the economy, but there was a greater amount of urbanization and market economy and trade that was going through the empire. In comparison, the Byzantine Empire was more militaristic than the Roman Empire, was also less urbanized, though there was periods of urbanization, such as in the 10th to the 11th century. We see urbanization rising again up to the levels that they were during the time of Justinian. But the empire was a lot more rural than it was in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was governed by a series of emperors who were generally considered to be one amongst equals. It was a structure that was put into place by Augustus to make it seem like the republic had been restored, but really what was going on was that they were cloaking the absolute power of the emperor for this idea that he was accepting his role, but he wasn't above that of the Senate in particular. He was answering to the Senate and the Roman peoples. That's why it's called the Principate, right? Then a couple centuries down the line, the emperor becomes more powerful, and it's called the Dominate. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, inherited this mentality. However, there was still this idea that it was an elective monarchy, that it wasn't something that had from going primogenitor. There was nothing about it was the eldest son who had to inherit the throne. It wasn't like that at all. But the system became more and more autocratic over time. The Byzantine Emperor was generally considered to be the representative of Christ, God, on the planet. And this is what justified his power. However, he was still answerable to the people. He was still considered to be one amongst equals, though by the Byzantine era, that didn't really seem to be how this. They weren't really pretending anymore that was really a serious thing, but it was still used in propaganda, especially on coins. So that's what we have for the government differences between the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. In terms of the religion, this is the biggest change. So between the Roman Empire was a pagan empire that was very tolerant of many other beliefs. They were tolerant of the Jews as long as they were paying homage to the Roman Emperor. They were very tolerant of all kinds of religious practices, and they would often incorporate them into their own pantheon. This is very different from what happens with the Byzantine Empire, because when the Eastern Roman Empire began, there was a period of toleration, but towards the end of the 4th century, we start to see the state becoming more intolerant. It makes Christianity the state religion. It starts closing pagan temples, breaking them down, using their stone to build monuments and churches for the new state religion. This is very different from the Roman Empire, when it was a lot more tolerant of other people's beliefs. The Byzantine Empire, especially after the Western Roman Empire fell, there were a series of religious revolts that were happening, where the Byzantine state was, especially during the Justinian, was very intolerant of certain sects of Christianity and really wanted to remove those from the society. If we look at, for example, the iconoclasm crisis or situation, or the revolution um, in the 8th century, we see that there's this interwoven religious conflict in the Byzantine state that stabilizes it. The Roman Empire really didn't have this sort of religious animosity that happened within its pagan system, mainly because I believe that it was a lot more syncretic. with the Christian religion being a much more homogeneous um, thing. You know, it was more geared towards the whole society had to be Christian. Roman society was a lot more syncretic. So that's the differences with regard to religion. On the topic of women, the Byzantine and the Roman empires were very highly patriarchal societies. However, Roman society, especially before the 3rd century, allowed for women a greater flexibility that wouldn't be seen in many other societies before or after. In particular, Roman women were able to run their own businesses, own their property, and also get that property in wills. They couldn't represent themselves in politics. However, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that shows that women, at least upper class women, were involved in politics. With respect to the Byzantine Empire, the Christian ethos of the empire meant that women in the empire became more reclusive, especially upper class women who were expected to be cloistered away and not be going out in public. For lower class women in the Byzantine Empire, it was largely the same for them. If they were in rural areas, they were working out on the farms. In the urban areas, they'd be running shops. It was the same generally as it was for the Roman Empire. But in the upper class became a lot more desirous, or they became a lot more. The Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire were both highly patriarchal societies. In the Roman Empire, there was women had a flexibility to live their lives in some respect. They could own businesses, they could also inherit property, they could write their own wills. They weren't allowed to participate in politics, though. In the Byzantine Empire, with the rise of Christianity, we have the rise of women being cloistered away, especially upper class women. For the lower classes, we don't see as much of that. A lot of lower class women continue to work on the farm and own their own shops in the markets. So those are kind of the similarities and differences between the two empires on women. Both the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire both had very powerful militaries. However, the Roman Empire had a military that spanned from all the way from northern England all the way to the Tigris River in Syria. In particular, the Roman Empire had a military that was much larger than that of the Byzantine military. It was a military that was really functioned around heavy infantry. The Romans didn't really start switching to cavalry until the later stages of the empire. One thing you do see with the Byzantine military is that, particularly during the era of Justinian, there's greater emphasis on smaller units than during the early Roman Empire era. So you have smaller numbers of soldiers, but they're more tactical about how they use those soldiers. They also have more cavalry than the Roman Empire in the earlier era did have. So in terms of that, the Roman Empire really was able to project its power in much further than that of the Byzantines. The Byzantines were not as interested in conquering territory. They were more interested in maintaining their borders, expanding when they had to, but they weren't as expansionistic as the Roman Empire was. So which empire do I think is the best? Well, both have contributed much to the human story, but I'm very interested in the combination of the imperial system of Christianity, the Byzantine Empire being a Christian empire, and how that change happened between the pagan empire and the Christian empire. I'm more interested in the Byzantines. They have my attention at the moment. So yeah, that's just my thoughts for this video, and please remember to subscribe.